Hello, and welcome to episode number 380 of the Armin Show podcast. Science, people, creativity, learning more, spreading knowledge. Share this on YouTube, wherever it might be. Short clips always coming out, which is nice. And like and subscribe if you might. On this episode here, we have a professor and a philosopher, author of a book. We'll be talking a bit about philosophy. My guest today is Professor Chiara Russo Krauss. Chiara, welcome to the show.
Uh, Hi, Armin, and thank you very much for inviting me to discuss my upcoming book on Joseph Petzoldt. I'm spoiling the topic of this episode.
This is wonderful. Yes, we will be speaking about that. And before mentioning the book, you are a researcher at the University of Naples, Federico II, Department of Humanities in Italy.
Yes.
Before we get into the book, your position, why are you there? How did you get into there? Why philosophy? How does that connect to you as a person?
I developed an interest in philosophy and history of philosophy while I was in high school. So I decided to study philosophy at the university and remained at the university ever since. So I was born and raised as a philosopher in Naples University. And I got pretty lucky because, as you know, it's not very easy to have a straightforward career at university, especially in topics such as philosophy. But I cannot complain because, yes, I succeeded into making philosophy my life. So I'm pretty happy with this, with everything, with how everything turned out in my life with philosophy, and that I was able to do what I love.
It's a special thing. It's nice when it connects with what you like and you can do it for a long time. It makes a big difference because there's compounding value when you're doing something regularly or of a prolific nature. Did you what was the earliest time when philosophy meant something to you? And was there any specific categories of it or topics in it that seemed to speak to you more?
Uh, Probably I always said like uh, mm, reflective attitude. I don't know how to say. Uh, and then while I was growing up, I think I was about 10 or 11. I remember that I always started to think about the world from a very general perspective, like that kind of existential questions that you start to ask yourself while you are growing up, like why are we here? What's the meaning of life? And I also had a religious education. My parents are Catholics, so I started to question myself whether God is real or not. So I was like involved in all these sort of questions all the day, and then suddenly I had to begin study philosophy because it was a topic, a mandatory subject at school, and it was like okay, finally something that is giving me not the answers but the tools to try to dig deeper with these questions. So it was meant to be in a way.
Based on just exactly what you said, the tools to look at it, and it's not really about the answers, but to look at it. What do you think about right now? It's connected directly. Artificial intelligence. There's a lot of questions about when you use these online services. The more important part is not what it gives you, but now the really important part is the questions you are giving the artificial intelligence to get what you want from it. Is the question more important than the answer in all of life?
Yeah, yeah, I think because first of all, the answers depends on the questions. So if you don't ask the right questions, you are never going to get the right answers. So you can even develop a machine that is amazing at giving answers, but you still need someone to ask the right questions to these machines, as you said. And philosophy surely helps you understand what are the kind of questions that you should ask, because different questions open up entirely different words, approaches, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, last thing before we get into the book is the university you are at. Is there anything about it that speaks to you directly? You're in Italy. Is there any philosophical history that comes to mind from there? Or what locations connect with you in what you do?
Yeah, as I said, I'm very much rooted at the Naples University since I studied there, and I've always worked there. And it also shaped how what is my philosophical approach, because here in Naples we have a very strong tradition in the history of philosophy with a strong philological approach. So like stay really close to the original text, always read the text in the original language, or also do archival researches on manuscripts, unpublished drafts. So this very strong historical and philological approach is very much taught in Naples. So I'm happy to be part of this tradition and to keep this school going, hopefully with my work. And you can see that in my book too, I discuss like correspondence, manuscripts, and these sort of things, and yeah, that are beyond the simple text that often philosophers is the focus of their investigations.
The details. Now, the book that you have written, or that is coming out very shortly, is called The Philosophy of Joseph Petzoldt, From Mach's Positivism to Einstein's Relativity. Who is this individual, and why was he selected to look at?
From a biographical point of view, so the point of view of my research, I end up studying Petzoldt, coming from my study of Avenarius, who was the main topic of my doctoral thesis. And even Avenarius is not a very much known philosopher nowadays, but he was pretty important back then. And Avenarius is Richard Avenarius is generally mentioned along with the more famous philosopher Ernst Mach, because it was thought that Mach and Avenarius were part of this general trend that is sometimes called empiriocriticism or empirical criticism, critical empiricism, with various names. But they are always or pretty often mentioned together as part of this school of thought, this current of the late 19th century. But while I was digging deeper on these issues and these topics, I find out that this idea that Mach and Avenarius were part of this same trend was actually an invention by Petzoldt, who was a pupil, a follower, and a friend of both Mach and Avenarius. So I thought that it was interesting to find how he managed to shape the reception and of these two philosophers so as to create this idea that they were part of the same trend. And so I decided to investigate his philosophy, and I thought it was interesting also because there was no publication on Petzoldt. And another characteristic of us in Naples is that we are we like to focus on these minor philosophers, so to speak. They are often left aside from the big histories of philosophy because they can reveal important parts of the history of philosophy that are that remain in the shadow, that may help to have the whole picture and understand how everything went. Like, so for example, for this Mach and Avenarius connection, it's part of the history of philosophy, but studying Petzoldt, now we know why it became this idea, how this idea that Mach and Avenarius were part of a school of thought came to be.
I noticed that in the material, and also I highly value when we look at the smaller entities or the niche individuals in a category, because it's very easy to look at the large figure that has like an umbrella over it, but without all the elements, it's kind of like, let's say you look at a tree, a lot is going on up there, but without all the pieces underneath that are elements of it, maybe not the whole large figure, that doesn't exist. And I don't like to discount that part. And everybody always looks at this part anyway, so it's not really, it's like when you park in front of a store, if you park in the back, you'll never have to find parking because nobody's there, because there's less people and it's harder work. But it's worth it because it's your own space versus here, all this traffic and rumble, but that's because the demand is heavy and everybody always looking at the main portion. So I like that part.
Yeah, and it's also like an alternative approach to the history of philosophy, because often there is this idea that the history of philosophy is like the gallery of portrait of all the important philosophers in chronological sequence. But history of philosophy is more about context, relations, how all these ideas evolved, grow, and pass to one philosopher to another. And if you want to connect the dots, then you will need the minor philosophers. Otherwise, you have only this portrait that stand there unrelated. But that's not history of philosophy.
It's missing some pieces, kind of like branches of a tree in a way. And yeah, the smaller to the larger in a way. Now, also one other thing is how much of philosophy should be looked at as like a past person handing the baton to the next person to run the race and continue the message, like a link through. Is it like a direct link? How would you describe the linkage of one generation to the previous?
I think that there are like two levels. One, I believe that there is this passing of the baton, as you said, element in the history of philosophy, because there are these also like personal relationships, like in the case of Mach, Avenarius, and Petzoldt. So they themselves often believe that they have the task to pass the baton. But the other level is that the context, the background, the history is changing. So even if you just want to pass the baton, you are in a different landscape in comparison to your forerunners. So your philosophy is going to deal with different problems, different political situation, different scientific discoveries, and you have to adapt and adjust and reflect this different landscape. So even if you want to pass the baton, you have to also reflect this the historical change in the context. And that's what make history of philosophy. So the continuity and also the disruptions related to the context.
Mm-hmm. I think about it like, even if I did the exact same thing that somebody did before or thought how they thought, but the time is different. If I copy their exact everything, it's still not going to come out the same because of all the different variables now. I can't even copy it if I tried, I think. No copy there. Now, few concepts are covered in the book, and even Einstein comes up, which is wonderful. And his philosophical landscape is described. One first topic is, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it properly, but Eindeutigkeit.
Eindeutigkeit.
Yes. And or unique features of an item. Can you speak on that, what that represents, and what Petzoldt got from his larger figures in that regard?
Yes, maybe we can talk about this topic of the principle of Eindeutigkeit, which is one of the main topic of Petzoldt philosophy in relation with his mentor Ernst Mach, so that we can understand also the differences between Petzoldt and Mach, because coming back to this passing of the baton, from a point of view, Petzoldt wanted to spread the philosophies of Mach and Avenarius, and he thought of himself like this spokesperson of this new trend that had to be defended and promoted in philosophical circles, associations, journals. But on the other hand, he, of course, also introduced some original elements in his own philosophy. So he didn't just parrot Mach and Avenarius' philosophy. And one of the elements that is original of Petzoldt philosophy is this principle of Eindeutigkeit, which can be translated as uniqueness or univocalness. And it's original in comparison to Mach because Ernst Mach philosophy has this sort of indeterministic tendency, because of course one of the main topic of Ernst Mach is what's science and how science relate to the experience, to the actual world. And the idea of Mach is that we human beings build and formulate scientific concepts, scientific laws as tools, practical tools to try to organize the world and to navigate the world. So ultimately, for Mach, science has this sort of pragmatic justification. So since it has a pragmatic justification, it doesn't have like a metaphysical assumption. So Mach doesn't say the world is actually like that. He says science works like that because we need some tools to, like for example, foresee how certain events are going to be. So we formulate these scientific laws and scientific concepts that allow us to make some predictions because these are useful. But as I said, ultimately there is a pragmatic justification. And what Petzoldt changes is that, on the contrary, he introduces this strong deterministic metaphysical assumption. So for him, for Petzoldt, the world is characterized by a strong necessity. Everything happens according to certain reasons, and nothing could ever go otherwise that it eventually go. So the concept of the principle of Eindeutigkeit is philosophical concept to address this issue. In particular, I try to explain this notion in the book using the image of the billiard ball, because I think that it helps understanding what Petzoldt had in mind. If we imagine the billiard ball, one billiard ball hit another. At first, we may think that the billiard ball that is hit may go in whatever direction. But in reality, it only goes in one direction. And this is the uniqueness, that the real trajectory is only one. So for Petzoldt, the task of science is to address this uniqueness. Why the conditions of these events led to this one trajectory. So the task of science is to reconstruct, describe the world in such a way as to explain why these conditions lead to only this one outcome. So in the case of the billiard ball, we use the law of the parallelogram of forces because there is only one diagonal. So the uniqueness of the diagonal is a tool to address the uniqueness of the actual real trajectory. But again, the important thing is that it's not only like an epistemological concept, Eindeutigkeit. It's not only that we have to find a unique description, but it's also a metaphysical assumption, because ultimately there is this deterministic assumption that the conditions of the event lead only to one outcome. Only that one outcome was necessary and it was bound to happen. And in contrast, for Mach, since there is a pragmatic justification, there is always a room for the world to go in other direction that we didn't predict, because it's just our attempt to bring order in the world, but we cannot assume that the world actually is ordered, necessary, and always go according to certain plans and certain laws and so on. I hope it was explained.
That's a wonderful explanation, and also it is related to, I think about it like A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and it was a direct link in these parts. So thinking that there was so many options from C to D, you would be saying it's not the case, and instead this was a direct link, and just to keep looking back, science would look back a few steps and see what leads to this in the first place as far as we would like to go, and then we analyze it.
Yeah, and it was also because in the 19th century there was this, we could say, not a rebirth, but a great spread of materialistic mechanisms. So the old idea that fundamentally the world is like a machine that happens according to necessary law. So once you set the world in motion, the whole future is already determined from the beginning, because being a machine, it cannot go in different directions. And Petzoldt embraced and endorsed this assumption, and yeah, as I said, his notion of Eindeutigkeit was an attempt to translate this idea in philosophical terms.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that concept related to, as you mentioned a little bit earlier about things would be that way, I think, something like that, relativistic positivism, which I read quite a bit about after the fact to find out more about it. And what is positivism and what is relativistic positivism, the link between things, and is it like guaranteed it would be that way, almost like you're making something happen?
Yeah, it plays a big part in defining this relativistic positivism, which is like the label that Petzoldt himself coined for his own philosophy. So it's not a term that I invented or some other historian or philosopher invented, but he himself chooses to define his philosophy as relativistic positivism. And in a way, we may say that relativistic positivism um, almost sound like an oxymoron, like two opposite philosophical positions merged together. Because, of course, relativism is the idea that we only know the world from our own perspective, from our own point of view in relation to us. On the other hand, Petzoldt believed, and that is the positivist part, that we don't know just the appearance of the world. We actually know the world. We do know the reality. And as I said, this is the positivist part. But one would say that these are contradictory assumptions or statements, because if you say that we only know the world as it appears to us in relation to us, then we do not know the actual world, but we only know its appearance. But that's what Petzoldt rejected, this conclusion, this deduction. So he agreed with the assumption we only know the world in relation to us, but he disagreed with the further implication, then therefore we only know the appearance of the world. And how can one accept the assumption but not the conclusion? The point is how we define this in a relation to us. Because generally in the history of philosophy, when we say we only know the world in relation to us, these us are the philosophical subjects, the egos, the forms of knowledge, the a priori forms of knowledge in Kantian terms, or all these kinds of concepts, the consciousness, and so on. But the difference is that for Petzoldt, when we say, or when he says, we only know the world in relation to us, this us is the actual human being, the organism, the brain, the nervous system. And that's where the principle of Eindeutigkeit comes into play. The point is that if knowledge is the relation between the world and the brain, and not the relation between an abstract object and an abstract philosophical subject, then this relation between the world and the brain works, happens according to the necessary laws of nature, according to to that necessity that is the principle of Eindeutigkeit. So the principle of Eindeutigkeit, the univocalness, the uniqueness, governs also the brain and its interaction with the environment. And that's therefore, that's the reason why relativism doesn't mean subjectivism or skepticism, because this relationship between our brains and the environment is governed by the laws of nature. So saying that the world is in relation to us, to our brains, doesn't mean subjectivism or skepticism. It means that our knowledge is a natural event, just like a thunderbolt striking a tree. A thunderbolt striking a tree is a relationship between the thunderbolt and the tree, and is governed by the laws of nature. Knowledge is a relation between the world, or a certain part of the world, and our brain, and it is as well governed by the laws of nature. So why should this relationship between the brain and the world be mysterious or more mysterious than the relationship between the thunderbolt and the tree? So, and that's why, that's what relativistic positivism is. This relative to us doesn't mean skepticism, because it's a relationship governed by the laws of nature that is part of the world. It's a natural event, knowledge, cognition, and so on. So it has, it's not something mysterious that we cannot explain, that we must investigate with philosophical tools. It's just something that we can investigate with scientific tools, with the tools of experimental and physiological psychology, and so on.
You mentioned subjectivism there. and maybe alternate points, what would be counterpoints to his view on this topic?
The problem with every attempt to reduce knowledge to the brain activity ultimately is always the fact that it's difficult to explain how consciousness arises from this physical activity that is the brain. So we can try to explain away, to say that it's a false problem, that consciousness is not something different than the brain activity that underlies it. But there is this quality in consciousness that it's difficult to reduce it to the activity of neurons, brain, and brain cells, and so on. So we can try to dig this problem out of the window, but it will always come back to haunt us.
Related to that, in the current moment, what are the largest views that exist on, this is unrelated to the book kind of, but on consciousness? What would you say are the prevailing views on how to look at consciousness today?
I think it's interesting that, of course, the two main adversaries in the debate about the mind-body problem are the physicalist view, which was kind of supported by Petzoldt, so that mind activity ultimately is the same as brain activity. And the other position is the dualistic point of view, that there is the mind and there is the brain. And I think it's interesting that in the last years there is also a resurgence of panpsychism. I don't know what is the precise.
Panpsychism.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was also a view that was supported by some thinkers during the 19th century, such as Fechner, who was an important influence on Avenarius and also on Petzoldt. And yeah, so it's interesting, but that we see like the same fighters still fighting each other nowadays than in the 19th century. So it's a proof that this problem probably it's never going to be solved because maybe it's just an unsolvable problem of philosophy. So there wasn't like an actual progress even after all the discoveries of neuropsychology and these sort of things. Because sometimes scientific advancement are just scientific advancement and cannot change in deep philosophical problems. So it's like, I don't know, like the oceans. The philosophical problems are very deep, and the scientific discoveries sometimes remain on the surface. Sometimes they can go deep enough to change also the philosophical questions, but all the innovations in the neuropsychological research couldn't affect the way the mind-body problem was already formulated in the 19th century, probably.
One thing I think about in relation to this is that even with the various changes of who knows how many years, the same biological processes that I have in my brain or running through are the same ones that somebody probably 8,000 years had going on, same vasopressin receptor and same serotonin and dopamine pathways. So those basic items for us physically have not changed much, and the things on top of that are kind of like the ripple on top of the ocean, but the base has not altered currently. Yeah, cannot change it so much.
Yeah.
But maybe after adaptation. Now, one other concept that is brought up is Einstein has a famous theory of relativity. Petzoldt has a view on relativity that is his own interpretation. Does he disagree with Einstein? Does he agree? Where do they mesh?
If you allow here to, I'd like to maybe begin with Ernst Mach to explain better what was Petzold's view on relativity. For this reason, and also, of course, because Ernst Mach was himself a big influence on Einstein, so that he may help us connecting the dots. And so, as I said, Mach influenced Einstein in that already Mach questioned the idea of absolute motion, absolute space, and absolute time that was part of the Newtonian view of the world. And in particular, Mach claimed that the concepts of absolute motion, absolute space, and absolute time had no meaning because we always define space, time, and motion in relation to something else. So even if there is no explicit frame of reference, we always need at least an implicit frame of reference to claim that something is moving, to claim that something happens in time, or that something has a certain position in space. Because, for example, saying that something is moving per se has no meaning because something is always moving relative to something else. To say that for example, if we say that there is only one object in the entire universe, it would make no sense to say that is moving or that is stationary, because the concept of motion is a relative concept. Something moves relative to something else. So the idea of Mach was that physics in particular have an implicit frame of reference in the fixed stars. So even when physics speaks of motion, time, space, without addressing what is the frame of reference that is using, these implicit frame of reference are the fixed stars. Now, in his correspondence with Mach, Petzoldt discusses these issues, and he, of course, accepts Mach's rejection of the concept of absolute space, time, and motion, but he claimed that the frame of reference of physics is and should be the human body. So again, the brain, the nervous system, because we actually regard the world from our own point of view, and this means from the point of view of our relationship with the environment, of the relationship of our brain with the environment and the world. So this should also be the actual frame of reference of physics. And in this way, we would also succeed in overcoming the fake boundaries between different sciences like psychology and physics. We would have this unified science that has the brain of man at its center. So this was Petzoldt idea of that we are our own frame of reference. So, as I said earlier, when we were discussing the passing of the baton and the changing philosophical context, Petzoldt wanted to promote Mach's philosophy, but he had to address the changing philosophical and scientific context that was characterized in the first decades of the 20th century by this revolution in physics that is the theory of relativity by Einstein. So since he believed that the theories, the philosophies of Mach and Avenarius were the only philosophies who could meet the challenge of modern science, he also had to prove that they could meet the challenge of the theory of relativity by Einstein. And in particular, he tried to support the thesis that this philosophy by Avenarius, but in particular by Mach, were the perfect philosophical interpretation for the theory of relativity, because there is this strong affinity between relativistic positivism and the theory of relativity. And in particular, there are two affinities. The first one, of course, is the relativism part, because like relativistic positivism claims that everything is there is no absolute reality, but the reality is always given in relation to something else. So the theory of relativity by Einstein claimed that we always have to refer to a specific frame of reference. In particular, for example, when we are measuring the length of a body, it doesn't make sense to talk about the length of a body in absolute without specifying in relation to what the frame of reference, because when a frame of reference is moving at a certain velocity, then the measurement of the length of an object will vary. And this is the first element that connects the two. And the second fact is that the fact that we always must refer to a frame of reference doesn't, or the fact that every description, every measurement is always relative to a certain frame of reference, and that therefore there is no absolute reality, doesn't mean that we fall into skepticism or a sort of solipsism of the frame of references, frames of reference, because the important thing is that there are laws, and these laws are what allow us to translate what we see in a frame of reference into what we would observe in a different frame of reference. So in the case of the theory of relativity, these laws are the Lorentz transformations, which are a mathematical series of tools that allow us to calculate, for example, the length of a body in a different frame of reference. So, to sum up everything, the important thing is that first, we always have to refer to a frame of reference, because everything is always in relation to something else. And the second element is that the lawfulness, the fact that these relations are governed by law, as a consequence that this relativity doesn't fall into skepticism, because the relations themselves are governed by laws, and so we can shift from one frame of reference, from one point of view to the other. So, according to Petzoldt, these two elements showed that the theory of relativity was a sort of scientific confirmation of the truth of relativistic positivism.
There's a strong link there. One thing you reminded me of was you had mentioned the arbitrary barriers between the sciences mentioned, and one time I spoke with Professor Lee Cronin at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and he connected them in some ways, physics, biology, chemistry, and the various fields, and he described how they're all linked. Well, how would you describe the link between the various fields, or how you see them, philosophy, math, all those? How do you look at that framework?
from speaking from my point of view or the point of view of Petzoldt?
I'm kind of curious of both, actually. So I would like
Okay.
Petzoldt first, because we were speaking about Petzoldt, and then your.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So from the point of view of Petzoldt, again, the problem is that to oppose the old concept of man as the subject, the philosophical subject, the ego, because if we human beings are subjects in the philosophical sense of the word, then you have two different fields. You will have the field of physics, which deal with the outer world, the external reality, the material world, and the field of psychology, which deals with the inner world, consciousness, the subject, and so on. So two dimensions, and therefore two fields of investigation. If, like Petzoldt did, you say that knowledge is not the dimension of the inner world, of consciousness, of the subjectivity, and so on, but it's simply this natural event, this relationship between the brain and the environment, then, as I said before, it's just another event in the world. So there is no actual difference between physics and psychology. Maybe you can have different field of investigation, different interests, but they are all part of one unified science which deals with this unified world which has no different dimensions in it. So from my point of view, again, I think that the problem of consciousness always come back through the window when you try to kick him out. So it's difficult to say that psychology has no peculiar field. And maybe a confirmation for this is that when Petzoldt was writing, they pretty much believed that the era of scientific psychology was coming, and once you study the mind through the brain, everything will be easy to understand. And so, but we are speaking in 2023, and psychology is very far from being a science. So this project kind of failed, and maybe this is further proof that consciousness ultimately is not so reducible to physics, to the physical world, to the activity of the brain, and so on.
One more on Mr. Petzoldt is, are there any current philosophers that are a branch off from his view? Has anybody followed a lot of what he has put out to today?
I think that an honest answer to this question would be no. And I also try to explain the reasons of Petzoldt failure, which of course may be Petzoldt fault, probably 50-50 at least, maybe because his philosophy was he tried to update this philosophy to meet the challenge of the new physics and Einstein physics, but maybe he didn't succeed 100%, also because he hadn't a very profound understanding of physics, because he hadn't studied physics, so he hadn't the mathematical tools, the mathematical understanding that was necessary to actually propose a philosophy of science that was meaningful. So this part is probably Petzoldt's fault. But there was also this event that kind of undermined Petzoldt attempt to propose the philosophy of Mach as the official philosophical interpretation of the theory of relativity. Because as I explain in the book, at first Einstein himself kind of endorsed Petzoldt interpretation of the theory of relativity. In 1914, when Einstein moved to Berlin, he was asked by this local newspaper, the Vossische Zeitung, to write an article to explain to the readers of the journal the theory of relativity. And at the end, he suggests two further readings, a book by the physicist Emil Kohn and a paper by Petzoldt himself that proposed this philosophical interpretation of the theory of relativity. So this is already a strong endorsement of Petzoldt interpretation. So one could say, if Einstein himself supported the Petzoldt interpretation of the theory of relativity, then this is something important that could make Petzoldt philosophy long-lasting. But there was this incident, I don't know how to define it, in 1921, when the son of Ernst Mach published this manuscript by Ernst Mach called The Physical Optics, with a preface in which apparently Mach dismissed and rejected the theory of relativity. And this created quite a buzz in the philosophical and scientific world of the time, because the connections between Mach's work and Einstein's works were well known and widely discussed and supported by Einstein himself. So to find out that Ernst Mach rejected the theory of relativity was quite a surprise for many people and for Einstein himself. And we can see a very big shift in tone in the writings of Einstein about Mach before and after the publication of the physical optics. So after this publication, where he finds out that apparently Mach dismissed the theory of relativity, he started to distance himself from Mach, from Machian philosophy. He apparently doesn't want to have anything in common with Mach anymore. And of course, this affected also Petzoldt, who was the main representative of Machian philosophy back then and the main supporter of the idea of the philosophical connections between Einstein and Mach, and therefore also between Einstein and his own Machian philosophy. And of course, we now know that the preface of the Optics is a forgery, is fake, because it was written by Mach's son Ludwig for various reasons discussed by Professor Geron Wolters in his book, who is the professor who made the philological work that discovered that the preface was a forgery. So we don't know if the poor Petzoldt would have remained more successful in the philosophical world if the fake preface of the physical optics was never written. Who knows?
It's funny to see that it's still about human connections of the time. Sometimes you look at the figures of the past and they are very like a statue. They did this and did this, but at their time there were still dealings between, and a made-up manuscript can still impact their relations and affects who supports who, just like people today would still have qualms between them while they have their broader message that they are putting out there. They're still humans at heart.
Yeah.
My two last questions for you. One of them, what would you want someone to take away from after having read your book?
Maybe apart from, of course, from knowing who was Joseph Petzoldt and what was his role in the history of philosophy, the importance of studying also minor philosophers. I hope that one may understand that we need this minor philosopher to connect the dots and broad light and support our understanding of a certain eras and the period of time, because otherwise we'll have these blind spots and we couldn't make sense of things, at least from an historical philosophical point of view.
We don't want to have those blind spots. And my last question is, are there any philosophers that have guided your trajectory or a big part of you going in one path? Are there any key figures that motivate your reasoning? Any individuals that come to mind along the way?
I don't know philosophers of the past, but from the point of view of my work, I try to follow the footsteps, if this is even possible, of Professor Federico, who is a great historian of philosophy, because I think he managed to reach that perfect balance between making scholarly academical work, so actual research that advances the knowledge of certain topics, but also remain readable and for a wider public. So I don't like philosophy that stay too much in its own lingo, that doesn't try to explain stuff. I think that it's always important to not always say something new, but also try to explain what you want to say or what the past philosophers were trying to say in a way that make it easy or as easy as possible for the reader to understand these concepts. So to not remain in our tower in the academic world, where we are almost unreadable for everyone else. So I don't know if probably I'm not as successful in this objective as Professor Beiser from Syracuse University, but he's like my the living example that it's possible to reach that perfect balance.
Making it approachable to people so they can link to it more closely than if it was further away, and also not needing to always reach for some sort of new concept. Maybe sometimes you can work on past concepts and understand them more clearly. That's great. Makes it more personable. Where might people find your work? Would you direct them anywhere to find your material?
Yeah, the book, The Philosophy of Petzoldt, is going to be published soon by Bloomsbury, so you can buy it in all the usual channels, and you can follow me on Twitter. I have my name, so it's very easy to find me, or on all the platforms that are usually used by academics like ResearchGate, academia.edu, and and I have a pretty unique name, so it's very easy to find me with Google.
This is true. I can agree on that. It is readily comes up. This is wonderful. And it's nice. It's very quick moving. I've always had the feeling that our names do a lot. If they're quick moving, then people remember us that way. If there is alliteration, it's more memorable sometimes. if there are certain parts of it that sound more upbeat, maybe they'll think of us as more upbeat. I think names have some sort of message to them.
Yeah, I think that for academics it's kind of a curse to be like John Smith, some basic name, no one can find you.
That's true. Where's Joe Smith? You mean Joe Smith 14 or 12? No,
Yeah.
54. Oh, okay. All right, good. That's pretty cool.
Okay, thank
Professor,
you again for having me, and it was very pleasant to discuss with you.
very glad to have had you on, describing a bit about Joseph Petzoldt, uniqueness, relativism, relativity, and related topics in philosophy. Professor Chiara Russo Krauss, glad to have you on the show.